Unmuting.
Well, thank you.
Yes, I'm pleased today to introduce to you Jan Diamiscus. I hope I didn't brutalize that name. He grew up an Air Force brat, born in Indiana. He attended 10 different schools in Illinois, Kansas, California, Arkansas, Ohio, and Puerto Rico. He graduated from Dartmouth College in 1967 and spent the next 4 years in the Air Force, mostly at Mount Holm Air Force Base in Idaho. He earned his PhD in 1976 at the University of Massachusetts. For his PhD research, he moved his family to Australia in 1974 to study Americans who had immigrated there. He taught at Melbourne University while completing his research. Upon returning to the United States in 1977, he became a professor of sociology at Utica College, where he lectured from 1977 until retiring in 2016. While at Utica, his research focused on Oneida County African American history, local slavery, and 19th and 20th century Black family structure. In 2001, he helped establish the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, focused on studying the local pre-Civil War abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. They were able to uncover many sites and identify previously unknown individuals who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Recently, they installed a 6-sign self-guided walking tour of Utica's Underground Railroad sites. You are all invited to visit the website. You will find access to the website in the chat room. There will be additional websites available also there. Dr. Diamiscus is now involved in the Fort Stanwix project sponsored by the National Park Service. He has compiled an exhaustive database of slavery, abolitionists, and Underground Railroad in Oneida County. He also serves on the boards of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. As I say, access to those websites will be in your chat room if you care to pursue it. With that, all of you help me invite Jan to tell us his story. Thank you.
Howdy, that was a brave effort, Bruce. The last name is DeAmicis.
DeAmicis.
But it's a rare person. Until I moved to Utica, nobody ever figured out how to do that. But there are a lot of Italians here, and so they did. I'm going to put this onto share screen. Okay. Can I share my screen? Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, we hear you, and you should be able to share your screen with the green icon at the bottom center of your.
Okay, here I go. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Did you disable the screen share? I'm hitting OK.
No, I haven't. You should be able to hit Alt-S on your computer and screen share, or the green icon in the bottom center of your monitor.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm located. I'm located right there. And it comes on with my Zoom icon and a prompt that says, host disabled participant screen sharing. And then it asks me, is that okay? What could that mean? Host disabled participant screen sharing.
I have not disabled anything, so I am not aware that you should be disabled. The only other way is I see my screen share up, able to do that. Do you have a file that you could send me and I would bring it up?
It's a huge file.
Larry,
Yeah.
Larry, one of the things, if you go down to screen sharing and enable screen sharing for everyone. That should enable him.
I have done that. Hopefully it'll come up for him. Sorry for the delay.
Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens.
I show that your network bandwidth is low, which may be affecting it.
Ah, can you see that?
Ah, there it is. Thank you.
Yes,
Now I'm going to see if I can put it onto my
you have come on board.
there. How about that? That's the first page.
Perfect.
I've got about 40 slides, and I've got about 20 minutes after 3, and I know you folks are disciplined about things. Jan DeAmicis, I retired from Utica College about 5 years ago, and I've become involved in a number of organizations that are focused on abolitionism, Underground Railroad, and the general anti-slavery movement in Oneida County and New York State in general. This screen shows 2 of the sites we're going to visit today. I'm going to show you about, I think, 5 sites that I think are particularly interesting. So let's go down here. A couple of things I want to clear up. First of all, it wasn't a railroad. Now, there's a little confusion going on today because there's a TV program called The Underground Railroad. That is a fictionalized, highly interesting but not accurate depiction of the Underground Railroad. They depict it as actually underground. It was not underground. It couldn't, of course, be underground. It was a series of safe houses. That's a simple way to put it. But most travel would have been done by night, and you never knew what was at the other end of your night's journey. It was a very, very risky thing. It was illegal by federal law, and in certain places by local state laws. It was illegal to help anybody who was trying to escape from slavery. And anybody could be a slave catcher. It could be someone chasing you or someone just willing to turn you in. The only way you could be 100% secure was if you were in Canada. And that's where many thousands of runaways ended up. We call them station masters and conductors. It's an easy way to talk about how people along the way harbored these fugitives and sent them from one station to the next, and often at risk to themselves, I'd put it. It was not as popular. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was considered very radical. I include that picture on the right because many folks that I talk with have never seen an enslaved person, and that was from the Virginia Slave Database. One of the sources that we kind of go to when I talk about the basic theme of this discussion is how do we know what we know about the Underground Railroad? Now, I say many paths to freedom. We know about in Oneida County, and I'm going to show you. Let's see, there, okay. This is an orientation, folks, and for some of you, it's not necessary, but I don't take that for granted. And you can see that the blue indicates the states where slavery is illegal. Now, if you from Virginia took your enslaved person to, say, New York, where slavery was illegal, federal law enforced the slavery. That is to say, you were not free just because you were in a free state. So by law, any law person, sheriff, bailiff, judge, could be enrolled in helping you to retrieve your property. Now I show here in orange the route that one of the stories takes us from Shenandoah County, Virginia. You can see that here, right? All the way to Philadelphia, New York, up to Albany, New York, to Utica, and then up to the town of Mexico in New York, and then on to Oswego. We have verified this story, but you can see it in perspective. Another thing about this map, and I'll take some time doing this, is it's very deceptive. If you were successful as an enslaved person to escape from slavery, your best bet was somewhere along that border between free and slave. Somewhere along that border, you're going to find people who can help you. You'll find a lot of free Black people, for instance. You'll find a lot of white people, but you don't know who. So if you were in say, Tennessee, Alabama, or if you were in Arkansas, or if you were in North Carolina, you may have gotten away, but you were very unlikely to make it. So most of your freedom seekers who were successful came from those border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Washington, D.C. That's where it was most likely to come. Those arrows are very deceptive. But you can see the scale of things. Like this journey I'm just talking about here, that's 600 miles. And put that into perspective. So if you're coming, say, from Kentucky, and you want to end up here, you've got to cover a lot of territory. So you see. So there were a lot of ways to make it. And some of them kind of defy your previous knowledge. We know, for instance, in Oneida County, that hundreds of freedom seekers passed through. We can verify it in a number of ways. I'll talk about that later on. How do we know? Between 1830, when I kind of say that the Underground Railroad began on a nationwide scale, in 1860, approximately with the Civil War, that's when the Underground Railroad operated. We know that several of these runaways were captured here in Oneida County. We can prove it. We know that some were captured and then rescued from the slave catchers, sometimes with armed intervention. We know that at least 250 runaway slaves came through Oneida County at one time or another. Some of them passed through. For instance, this is where Harriet Tubman came through, for instance. Some of them passed through quietly. Some of them stayed here for a while. Some of them actually lived out their lives here for a while. So we can document hundreds of freedom seekers coming through here. How do we know that a site is an Underground Railroad station? How do we know the people who were involved? How do we know things actually took place so long ago? We rely on documentation, records and accounts of the day, documents of the time, verbatim accounts, academic literature, newspapers, US and New York State Census Records, public documents. For instance, a document that shows this enslaved man professes to be a free man of color before a judge. The document is signed with his X and so forth. Autobiographies, published local histories, congressional petitions, and so on. Anybody tells you about tunnels, hidden rooms, rumors, quilts, my gosh, quilt theory is awful. Lawn jockeys, they do not really understand the Underground Railroad. It didn't really quite operate like that. There's a lot of misinformation about it. So I already showed you that. The best evidence we can gather is that maybe over that 30-year period of time, maybe 30,000 people made it to freedom, that is to say, to security of some sort. They were not recaptured, that is to say. Most of the people who tried to escape were recaptured. You'll never know about how many people those were. That's Oneida County in the state of New York. We're about 250 miles from Utica. If you go to Albany over here, then you go down here, there's New York City. We're right in the middle of cows and corn, and there's the Appalachian Mountains, just to give you a sense of where we are with respect to things. One thing that you should note is that the Erie Canal goes just like this. It's Syracuse and all the way to Buffalo, right square through here. This was a pathway to history. It's a very amazing place to stay. Your screen sharing, oh, okay. Just to give you a sense of perspective, folks. So we're gonna visit these sites in Oneida County. Florence, town of Florence, these are towns, they're not actually a village. Remsen and Steuben, Oneida Institute, Hillcrest Cemetery, and the Utica Rescue. So let's take off. First of all, we're gonna visit the Oneida Institute, which is about 10 miles outside of Utica. And this was breathtaking in its historic importance. Very few people have known about it. It is the first college that admitted Black people on a same footing with white people. It wasn't a white college that let Black people in. It was coexistent from the bottom up. It was a labor and scholarly college. This is the beginning of Oneida County's abolition movement. This fellow, Beriah Green, comes to the college in 1833, dedicated to operating an abolition center in Oneida County where none existed. He intended to make abolition, this place a loudspeaker for the movement. And he accepted students who would become part of that movement. And so they got together, they formed the first anti-slavery society in New York State dedicated to immediatist principles, important term. That what that meant was we want slavery ended immediately. No compensation, no sending people to Africa, none of this gradual emission, immediate, which meant, of course, billions of dollars of property were supposed to be let loose from the people who were owning them. They organized all over the county. They organized slavery, anti-slavery groups. Within 5 years, there were at least 35 of these anti-slavery groups around the county where none had existed before. A newspaper, The Friend of Man, was published at the Oneida Institute, became the the voice, if you will, of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. Remember, this is before telegraph, this is before railroads. The printed word was vital in getting the word out. Graduates included famous black former freedom seekers, Logan and Garnett. They were runaways. They were living openly there, but they could easily have been recaptured and brought back south. Green and his students, they actually took people in. We can prove all of this, folks. So the Oneida Institute is a very important place. There are no markers there right now. Those buildings do not exist. Right now, there's a factory that makes signs for, for football fields and stuff. None of the traces of the buildings remain, but we intend to publicize it one of these days. It's on our agenda. The Oneida Institute is important because it starts the whole Underground Railroad movement in Oneida County. This is what Beriah Green looked like. You and I would not have gotten along with him. He was very radical, and it was his way or nobody's way. But sometimes that's what took for people to get this thing going. This is one of the people I said who was living openly, although he was an escaped slave from Tennessee. Jermaine Logan became the station master in Syracuse and personally harbored hundreds of slaves in his own house. He was well known for that. Henry Highland Garnett was another slave living openly who became famous because he was one of the first people to say, slaves, get your rifles, get your pitchforks, get an end to this. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. That was extremely radical for the day. You can imagine for the day. So this organization, the Oneida Institute, was very powerful voice to not only open up the county, but to spread the message beyond the county. So how do we know? Well, first of all, the definitive work was written by Dr. Milton Cernett, Abolition's Acts. Milton documents this through such things as correspondence between Beriah Green, such things as rosters of the Oneida Institute. For a variety of ways, he tracked down all possible documentation. The Friend of Man, we have copies of the Friend of Man that was published there. We have Jermaine Logan, who published his own autobiography, and he mentions the Oneida Institute as a place where we found freedom and helped harbor slaves, runaways. Prominent graduates, and we know a lot about these people through their autobiographies. Actually, a lot of documentation of Beriah Green's activities. So there are a lot of ways that we can document this. So when we say we know this is true, we know this is true. So we're going to move from Whitesboro, which was about here, into Utica, into the very heart of where Utica began. Utica was incorporated as a village in 1835, and in 1836 there was the Utica Rescue at Judge Hayden's law office. Now, Harry, Bird, and George, we know for sure that they were escaping from enslavement. They had been living in Shenandoah County, Virginia, who tracked them down by documents to the will of the person who died and left them to his wife. Judge Hayden, so the slave catchers enlisted the local constable to capture these characters. They held them overnight in a local jail, took them to the judge, and the judge had the right to say, take them away. No photographs. All the guys had to say was, they are our people. And that's all it took. They could be anybody. How could they prove they were free? They had no legal right to representation. They were hung out to dry, except 2 doors down. Spencer Kellogg saw them going by that morning. He walked in and said, these are free men of color. I'm going to prove it. He goes down the block, brings in Alvin Stewart, a lawyer, and Stewart says, I'm going to prove they're free men of color. Judge says, we'll handle this when I get out from work. He goes off to work. Now, if you know anything about upstate New York in the winter, it's late December and it gets dark early. And as it gets dark, a crowd gathers in front of the building and they break into the building. They beat up the slave catchers, mostly Black people, as we understand, and they sent them on to the town of Mexico, New York, and then to Oswego, and then finally to Canada. Hold on, I'm going to go back. This is the route they took. Now we know for sure that they went to Philadelphia because the person who let them free went to Philadelphia. Then we know for sure they went to New York. And we know for sure they went to Albany because this is all the story they actually told. Then we know for sure they came to Utica because that's where they were freed from enslavement. Then we know for sure they went to Mexico because they ran into an abolitionist there and they told their story to this guy. So we can document this in all kinds of ways. Here we are, caught up. How do we know? Now we're back to kidnapping. Okay, so this mixed group, but mostly black people, set them free. The black people in Oneida County were very active. Jermaine Logan in his autobiography, he quotes, "Brave colored men of Utica," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, it was success. Nobody was ever prosecuted. They broke the law, by the way. They could have been prosecuted. They could have been sent to prison for tens of thousands of dollars. Nobody ever paid a penalty for it. This is what that building looks like today. It's actually in a good state of repair now. Remember, it's 1833 is when it was built, almost 100 years ago. But and this National Underground Railroad is the official National Park Service authorization to designate this as an official site on the nation's Underground Railroad. This is the only one in Oneida County. We're very proud of that. That designates this is the place where it happened. National Park Service certifies it. Go to the National Park Service website if you don't believe me. Yeah, I know you believe me. This is where it looks like now. This is what the two prominent people look like. Spencer Kellogg later became a mayor. Alvin Stewart, very prominent in national abolitionism. There's the building when I first saw it, and it was a shambles, except here the windows are all fixed. When I first saw it, oh, there they are. I went in, it was awful. It was this is a historic line of buildings, by the way, all built at the same time in 1833 on the National Registry as the oldest contiguous masonry buildings in the city of Utica. This is what it looked like inside, and it was falling apart. Utica College thought about buying it as a historically important site, and it figured that it was going to cost too much. A local developer, no, a local businessman, he actually owns a heating and plumbing company. He bought the building for cheap. The town wanted to get rid of it. He couldn't collect taxes. Overhauled it, built 2 apartments. There's some hot apartments around here. These loft apartments are big. Built a nice space downstairs for commercial development and then has a terrace on the roof. Very, very nice. He calls it now the Hayden Building after Judge Hayden's, the official title for the National Park Service is the Utica Rescue at Judge Chester Hayden's law office. It is now the Hayden Building. We're going to put a big sign up there one of these days. We got permission from the owner to do that. How do we know? I could go on and on because a lot has been written about this. What's important, especially, 2 things. The people who actually talked to Harry Bird and George, the fugitives, as they fled to Canada. They actually met, and this guy had long conversation with them, and they told their story. We also know that the local newspapers, 2 different newspapers, one pro and one anti-slavery, wrote about it in depth. We know about interviews with various people. We know a lot of things about it, including the backgrounds of the principal people who were involved. So there's no lack of information, especially going down to Shenandoah County and looking up John Geyer's will, the listing of slaves, the backgrounds of the slave catchers who actually came up here to Utica. All that stuff is a joy to discover. Okay, now we're going to Robert Everett. I figured this could be quick. Robert Everett and the Welsh. Here we are in Utica, right? And now in 1840, this is very undeveloped and moving into the Adirondacks here. It's still pretty agricultural. There's very little development built there. Robert Everett of the Welsh. This became a center of Welsh settlement in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and so forth. And this fellow, Robert Everett, deliberately went up there in 1838 and established at the chief Welsh church in the area, Capel Utica it's called, established an abolition center at Capel Utica. And we know that he and his wife protected refugees in their home. We know that he was outspoken in his sermons about anti-slavery, about abolitionism, and so forth. We know that he established this anti-slavery society in Remsen. We know that what made him particularly important was that he established a Welsh language printing press in his house. And this printing press was important because there were very few Welsh language literature outlets in America at the time. So his newspapers and his tracts and his point of view got spread to the entire nation's Welsh language speaking population. And especially things like he got Uncle Tom's Cabin translated into Welsh. So he did it in a serial fashion. So every week they would gather around and listen in Welsh, which if you know Welsh, is this flowing linguistic, it's beautiful. That newspaper in upstate New York, surrounded by cows and corn, made its way to India, made its way to England, made its way to Ireland, made its way wherever the British flag flew, there were Welsh people reading his newspaper. Due largely to him, the Welsh population went from, who cares about slavery, to very strong anti-slavery, very powerful influence. That's what they look like. This is before photography. That's what, before it burned down, that's what the church looked like. This was an artist's rendition. The cemetery is still there. The foundation of the church is there, but the cemetery is there, and his grave and his wife's grave are there. That's how do we know? We have, for instance, this letter from the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh, come on. Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's giving permission to him to publish Uncle Tom's Cabin in Welsh. This is one of the three principal anti-slavery newspapers that he published. I hope none of you are Welsh because you'll correct me immediately. So this is one of several items that help to move the Welsh language. Now, this is interesting. These people are lined up. They're giving how many days they're going to go around to Oneida County handing out these anti-slavery petitions. Before the meeting starts, as you can see on the right, George French, a fugitive slave from Tennessee, gave his short sketch of his life and family and escaped from, followed by Mr. George Lawson. That, I tell you, is original documentation of the Underground Railroad. Here we have a petition that they sent, and you see that instead of saying citizens of Oneida County, it's Welsh inhabitants of Oneida County. They were very strong in their anti-slavery position. Paris Hill, I think this is the last one. I'll make this the last one. You're using a lot, but I'll make this the last one because it's such a lovely story. Paris Hill Refugee Community, we call it. And this is the story, and we can document this story, that they arrived from Maryland, these two people. One of them's not, we still don't know who that name is. They arrive in the Post Street in Utica, and a black barber, Robert Johnson, guides him to Wesley Bailey, who's publishing an anti-slavery newspaper 2 blocks away, the Liberty Press on Devereaux Street. We have a sign there now. We also have a sign on Post Street. Bailey directs them to Paris Hill, which is about 20 miles away, about 25 miles away. And they pass by way of the farm of Black abolitionists Charles and Sarah Wills in New Hartford. It's about halfway between Paris Green and Utica. They lived their lives out, at least one of them, in Paris Green, which is predominantly white. It's entirely white, except for, and so we'll show you that. They found employment there. They bought a house there. They lived their lives out and were buried there. And they joined other freedom seekers who had also found shelter there. Let's take a look. This is their graves. These are their graves. We do not know the names of the people in these little markers here. We do know what that says, but this is what the area looks like. This is the lovely, lovely hills of Oneida County. This is corn and cow country, folks. This is what that grave marker says. This is called documentation. I'm sure you can read this, right? I can tell you the first time I saw that, I almost broke down in tears. That is just so poignant in that lovely little cemetery right next to a volunteer fire department in the house with 2 fire engines, right in the village of Paris Hill, which is maybe, 200 people overlooking this area. And there we found these 7 people. The refugees were employed by these people. In fact, we know that this house is still there. We found it. We know that they bought a house. We know that they sent anti-slavery petitions to Congress more than any other town in the whole county, whole of Oneida County. This is their house, we're pretty sure. Here's a map of 1858. They were still there. So here's Roberts and Thomas's, right? Those are the people, names of the freedom seekers. And we know that that house is the right era. That's right on the corner. If you go another 50 yards, you're looking over at the countryside, et cetera, et cetera. This is just, it's still lovely countryside, dairy country especially. How do we know? The gravestones description, census records. Let me give you just a little bit of insight and documentation. In the US and New York State Census, they ask you, where were you born? Before 1860, if you were Black and they asked you, what is your race? If you were Black and you said Virginia, you were for sure a runaway. If you said Tennessee, if you said Maryland, if you said Washington, D.C., remember, mostly the border states there. If you said Kentucky, you were for sure. And we have documented this in many, many ways because nobody was selling enslaved people from Virginia and Kentucky and Missouri and Delaware. They were selling them to Georgia and Louisiana and Alabama, where the cotton fields were just opening up. And the vast, vast increase in the value of enslaved workers meant that there was a $1,000 enslaved man, say 30 years old, was like a $75,000 investment back then. We checked that out. So you don't let them free. They ran away because otherwise they're going down to Georgia. That's why Harry Bird and George got away, because their mistress, who had their use but not their ownership, she was going to die. And she really liked these 2 guys. She watched them go. She gave them money and told them how to get away. Well, that's part of the story. We can go on. There's a lot of information that documents this. I'm going to say that is my 25 minutes, although there's one more story, but that's up to you guys. Please.
One more story, please.
Okay, here we go. Now we're going to go to the extreme end of the town of Florence. Like this little area is a town. There may be 1,000 people in this whole area. This is a big area. From here to here is about 75 miles. It's a large-sized county, not the biggest county. Town of Florence is where we're going, folks. We started out in Utica and Marcy and down here and so forth. I'm just giving you an idea that the Underground Railroad was all over the place. The Florence Farming and Lumber Association, we can document its existence in those years right there, 1840s, 1860. And it was a real historic find. It was organized by a man who himself had once been enslaved. He secured his freedom. He got land from Garrett Smith, who was a local billionaire, like Bill Gates. Not only was he a billionaire, but he gave away a lot of money, and he was an abolitionist, and he harbored hundreds and hundreds of runaway slaves in his estate down in Peterborough, New York, in Madison County, about 40 miles from Utica right now. So Stephen Myers got a hold of this big hunk of land, cheap, we think for free, from Garrett Smith, who owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And he was going to create a Black community based on an independent, self-sufficient economy of farming, potash production, lumbering, using water-powered mills. The Industrial Revolution hadn't quite reached there yet. Water-powered mills, but there's a lot of water to go around. A church, a formal structure. They had president, secretary, treasurer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know it started by at least 1846, and we know it was over by 1860. Interesting experiment that didn't work. I can give you actually 2 good reasons why it didn't work. One reason is the land is lousy for growing anything. Just really deep, shallow, shale. It retains water, it doesn't drain, it's hilly. Terrible place to have to try to make a living. Also, they want to tax it. Didn't matter if you had a farm or not, but you owed taxes on that land. And these were people who didn't have a lot of money. So at least one person we know of, actually I know several, Walter Hawkins was a freedom seeker, and we know he got one of those farms on this land, and we know he ran away to Canada with his family after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 took place. And that was a particularly harsh enforcement of recapture of fugitive slaves. We knew that he was likely to be found out, but we know he was enslaved because he wrote about it in his autobiography. We know a lot of things about him. We just don't know what exactly which farm it was on. However, Jessica Harney, a member of my Underground Railroad Committee, the Freedom Trail, she has got her students out there, and they have tracked down the location of this farm, of this area. It's all overgrown. It's totally overgrown now with, with the low growth, shallow root trees. And she found it and has got her students mapping it out. Now we know it existed. For instance, we found newspapers that referred to it over and over and over again. And guess what? Here's Walter Hawkins. Remember that freedom seeker who had to run to Canada because they found out? That's Walter Hawkins. He was one of the people there. And it mentions Garrett Smith, who owned the land at one time. Here's another article that talks about Garrett Smith's land in Oneida County. So we know an awful lot that this thing actually existed, but we can't tell you definitively what happened to it. This is Walter Hawkins. That's a valuable picture, folks. That's the only picture we have of a successful freedom seeker from Oneida County. We don't have, that's a valuable piece of picture. So the State Archaeology Survey has taken interest in this survey, and now they've mapped out where all of these farm buildings were located on this one plot of land, and we think it was his land. Okay, let's see. Okay, so there's one of our committee members, Jessica Harney. She finally got one of these signs put up a couple of years ago to show in 45 letters or fewer exactly what took place here. What took place here was much more interesting than what the sign can express, but we'd like to get a better sign from that. Tax records, Walter Hawkins wrote about it, became a bishop in the church. Archaeological evidence, we located the farms, et cetera, newspapers. So we have documented its actual existence. We know that runaway slaves were always at risk. We know that, for instance, a very prominent Underground Railroad station master here in Utica, James DeLong, we know that he had always had to be alert for the presence of slave catchers. Now, how do you know a slave catcher is going on? Well, because the Erie Canal ran through here, and the people who worked on the Erie Canal, if you got to Utica, the barbers, the hotel.
Jan, we've lost, you're muted. Jan, you're muted, please.
Please unmute again. For some reason, you went mute. Jan?
When did that happen?
The system's a little unstable, sorry.
Oh, it's probably my fault. I do stuff like that. Did I get to talk about that?
A little bit. Please, please reiterate.
Okay, here we are at the site of the Florence Farming and Lumber Association in northern Oneida County, hidden from history. Nobody knew about this until we uncovered it. We know that it existed. We know because newspapers all over the country, all over the north, they talked about it. We know that it had a formal structure because the newspapers listed. We know that at least one runaway slave lived there with his family of 3 kids and a wife. They lived there, and he was still being hunted down. And we know that he had to run off to Canada, leaving his land behind because slave catchers were likely to show up after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Jessica Harney, well, this is the documentation. I'm rushing, folks. This is what he looked like. And I didn't have a chance to tell you then that this is a very precious photograph, as fuzzy as it is. This is the only photograph we have of an actual fugitive from Oneida County. And he lived here long enough, and by Jove, there's Walter Hawkins. and he had to run off to Canada. The state has taken interest now, and they have mapped out the site of his farm. We're pretty sure it's his farm. This is where all these buildings is. Right now, there's nothing there. It's all covered with scrub growth. In fact, it's even hard to find the place now that they've got a sign. Maple Hill Road, if you can read it. But it's now being mapped out by her students. And her students, this is Jessica Harney, they finally got this sign put up, and that's what it looks like all over there. Imagine trying to figure out, did anything ever exist here? And then they finally found foundations to things, and they figured out this is the well, and this is this. It's really a fascinating story. I'm going to end it there. We know it existed. We've got all the evidence, etc. And just to remind you that they were always on the lookout. I'm part of the Oneida County Freedom Trail. Mary Hayes Gordon, Deirdre Sinnott, Jessica Harney with a sign, and Ellie Collins. We're all involved in stuff. And I'll leave that up if you want to ask questions.
Jan, how long did it take you to put all this information together? How long have you been working on the upper New York State Underground Railroad?
I started the committee with a colleague at a meeting. I didn't know anything about it. In 2001, I went to a talk. Someone said, you ought to go listen to it. I went to a talk on the Underground Railroad. At the end of his talk, he said, every county ought to have a committee to study this. So I raised my hand and said, I'll start one. And the guy behind me said, I'll join you. And so that's how I got started in 2001. So since that time, we have been accumulating this information. So I don't take credit for having accumulated the information, only massaging it into a form to share it with you guys. And we're still accumulating information. We now have at least 41 sites that we could nominate for a National Park Service sign. We found all kinds of stuff lately. But so it's taken 20 years to accumulate the information, if that's a fair answer. Before that, I knew nothing.
This is just excellent, excellent. You should be more than commended for all this work. Bravo.
Isn't it nice to do something fun when you're retired?
Oh, heck yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Jan, this is Glenn Avila. Hey, just recently I saw a notice about a Underground Railroads TV series that's going to start on, I think it's on Amazon Prime.
Yeah.
And it's like a 9-part series. The reviews look really good. I mean, real promising. Have you heard anything about that particular series?
As I understand it, it is based on a novel called The Underground Railroad.
Right.
Where the novelist depicts the Underground Railroad as actually being underground. Now, 20 seconds of thought tells you that can't possibly be hidden for very long. So, but the novelist depicts it as being underground and builds and weaves the story around that. And as I understand it, the TV program depicts it as being underground. So from that point on, I mean, starting at that point, it is not historical.
Right.
Now, my understanding is that history is woven in and out of the narrative. That's what I understand. But you can't start by saying it was underground when it wasn't underground. So it's a fictionalized account. That's my understanding. I understand it's very fun though.
Yeah, I think it's from the viewpoint or from the eyes of
reviews.
Yeah, it's from the viewpoint or from the eyes of a child, I believe, or from a very young person, and you know their impression of the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Say, Jan, do you have a problem with us recording and posting your presentation online?
Oh, please do. This is the biggest audience I ever had as an academic. Yeah, there's nothing secret about this, and I'm interested in sharing the information. And my good friend Doug Twitchell from across the bay there, I'm going to be talking with his group of sirs as well. So I'm interested in sharing the information, and we're looking for more and more ways to do that. For instance,
advocate Harry Truman's. You have it. Don't know. I didn't know that the quote.
I didn't quite get that.
John, please repeat.
Jan, the work that you've done here, you've done what the late Harry Truman advocated. You have to find out the history you don't know and the significance of the history. This is just enlightening and inspiring, and it just makes America even better, the work that you've done and how well people work to do this.
It's an
Thank
amazing
you for
story.
doing this work and putting it together.
So I appreciate that. That's kind of slap on the back that I academic appreciate. So I enjoy doing it as well. And I'm working with as a retired person, I'm working with historians. I'm a sociologist, but I'm working with professional historians who've studied this and learning, you know, how to look inside of, like, how do you tell if that's a building that was built before the Civil War? And I'm working with people who can tell you that. Oh, well, there's another 6 over 6. What are you talking about? Oh, well, you know, the windows they built back then were 6 panes over 6. Oh my God. So it's really a joy to work with professional historians and contribute. It's fun to contribute to that group. It's fun. Everybody should have a hobby.
Yeah, this is Bruce, Dr. Diamici.
Jamie,
Really?
please, no doctors. I'm retired.
Okay, Jan, really appreciate it. We'll get word out to a lot of other service club in the area, and yeah, I'm sure you'll get contacts. I suspect that when you were in high school and your teacher assigned you a research project, he got a lot more than he expected. Thank you so much for what you put together.
Well, thank you guys. I hope you have a good time.
Any more questions?
All right. I'll see you later. Guess what? I got a Zoom meeting in 20 minutes.
Okay, good luck to you.
I'll see y'all later.
Bye-bye.